Let me first introduce the speakers and the session. So we have Allison Christie, Director of International Policy and Engagement at Natural Resources Canada, and Paolo Quercia, Director of the Research and Analysis Unit at the Italian Ministry of Enterprises and Made in Italy, and my co-chair of the task force, Gaylor Montmasson-Clair from Southern Transitions. And so we will hear first from Allison and Paolo on how you see this, how to reconcile economic growth, international collaboration, the issue of critical minerals, and also G7 priorities of your countries and governments. And then after that, we'll see a presentation from Gaylor about the paper that we presented with the task force and the recommendations. After that, I will go back to Allison and Paolo and ask you for your comments and thoughts on the paper and the contents. And then afterwards, hopefully we can have some discussions also with the other participants who are online. So again, feel free to put your questions in the chat box in the Q&A, and we'll then talk about those. But Allison, over to you first. I see you've got your camera on. Thanks for joining.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Is my audio okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. No issues.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, evening to those joining from elsewhere in the world. I'd like to extend a thank you to the Think 7 organizers to be here, and also share my regrets that our Director General, Rachel McCormick, was unable to join. She was looking forward to participating today. But I am here pleased to be here to offer Canada's perspective on how we can reconcile economic security with international cooperation using the example of critical minerals as a powerful example on how we can do that. We see today that geopolitical fragmentation is deepening, exposing vulnerabilities across our most strategic supply chains, and critical minerals are no exception. We see this in growing market concentration, sudden supply disruptions, and the increasing use of non-market practices that distort access to essential minerals like rare earth elements. From Canada's perspective, economic security and cooperation are not opposing goals. We strengthen both when we work with trusted partners, and it's this commitment to partnership that guided Canada's leadership within the G7, in particular last year during Canada's presidency. Through our presidency effort, Canada led the development of the G7 call to action on enhancing energy security, which is now guiding collective efforts across the G7. It's built on 3 core pillars. The first pillar, securing critical minerals and technology supply chains, codified 2 major Canadian-led initiatives, the Critical Minerals Action Plan and the Critical Minerals Production Alliance. Both of these mechanisms are designed to enhance diversification, raise standards, and shore up resilience from across the value chain, from exploration and extraction to processing, manufacturing, and recycling. The second pillar, building resilient electricity infrastructure, recognizes that energy security relies on reliable, modernized electricity system. And the last pillar, strengthening gas security, acknowledges the ongoing role of natural gas in meeting near-term energy needs and maintaining affordability for households and industry. Together, these pillars reinforce energy independence and system resilience. And of course, energy security cannot be separated from mineral security. So specifically to critical minerals, global competition is intensifying, and with it, the risk to both economic security and national security. In response, the G7 has recognized that no country can tackle these challenges alone. One of the most significant outcomes of Canada's G7 presidency is the Critical Minerals Action Plan, a foundational coordination tool designed to meet this moment. The action plan commits G7 members to build standards-based markets, mobilize investment, and promote innovation across critical mineral value chains. It's anchored in principles that Canada has long championed: diversification, transparency, sustainability, and responsible production. Importantly, the plan also establishes a shared commitment to coordinate responses to non-market practices, diversify supply sources, and safeguard resilient supply chains across the G7 and beyond. A major deliverable under the action plan was the roadmap to promote standard-based markets for critical minerals, released by G7 energy ministers in October 2025. Through the roadmap, G7 members agreed to strengthen environmental, labor, and governance standards, improve traceability and transparency across value chains, and reduce dependence on non-market suppliers that undermine fair competition and long-term security. Together, the action plan and roadmap aim for G7 cooperation, ensuring the critical mineral sector grows in a secure, sustainable, and truly collective way. Complementing the work on the action plan is the Critical Minerals Production Alliance, also launched during Canada's G7 presidency. The alliance was welcomed by G7 members as a shared effort to diversify and secure global minerals production, support responsible development, and counter market concentration and manipulation. Bringing together G7 members and trusted partners, including Australia, it provides a coordinated mechanism to strengthen secure and resilient supply chains and accelerate strategic projects that reduce vulnerabilities, support industrial competitiveness, and reinforce long-term supply chain resilience. Since October, the Alliance has delivered major progress through 2 waves of investments and partnerships. The first round included 26 strategic investments, partnerships, and measures, together supporting $6.4 billion in critical minerals projects. The second wave, which was announced just last week, included 30 additional critical mineral partnerships, unlocking $12.1 billion in new investment. And so together, these 2 rounds demonstrate how coordinated G7 action can mobilize capital at scale, reducing risks, accelerating timelines, and strengthening supply chain resilience. Under France's G7 presidency, members are continuing collaborative leadership of this alliance. Each G7 member has appointed a national envoy with a mandate to coordinate sovereign tools, investment strategies, financing approaches, and offtake agreements. This coordinated leadership structure ensures we can align policies, pool resources, and move faster on projects that matters. But coordination cannot stop at the G7. Critical mineral supply chains are global, and securing them requires a global effort. Canada is strengthening its roles in key international organizations such as the OECD and IEA, including chairing the IEA Critical Minerals Working Party. We're also supporting global initiatives with 30 million committed capacity building in emerging markets through the World Bank RISE partnership, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, and the Mineral Skills Network. At the same time, Canada is strengthening bilateral and regional partnerships. Over the past year, Canada has established new formal mechanisms for critical minerals cooperation with Germany, Australia, and Saudi Arabia, and continues to advance and implement existing collaborative frameworks with the EU, UK, Japan, Korea, and Argentina, among others. Taken together, these partnerships ensure access to diverse sources, markets, and technical expertise, while reinforcing a shared commitment to responsible, transparent, and sustainable supply chains. We've also set up some domestic tools to reinforce this international work, such as the First and Last Mile Fund for Infrastructure, the Critical Mineral Sovereign Fund, and the Strategic Response Fund, to name a few. These tools help to de-risk projects, strengthen supply chains, and ensure that global cooperation is backed by domestic capability. And so this brings me to a key point. Back to the theme of why we're here today, is that critical minerals do not need to be a source of rivalry. When countries invest in responsible development, shared standards, transparency, and diversified supply, competition becomes a structured partnership. The T7 Solutions paper emphasizes that inclusive, responsible, and circular value change, and Canada supports that vision. So Canada remains committed to securing resilient, transparent, standards-based critical minerals value chains, mobilizing investment and innovation across the G7 and with trusted partners, and by driving sustainable and inclusive growth to strengthen both economic and energy security. At the end of the day, cooperation isn't just compatible with economic security, it's the path to achieve it. Thank you, and back to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you very much, Allison. That's great. And yeah, very much like your final remarks about the importance of collaboration to achieve security. And it's also very interesting to hear the latest update, as you mentioned, 30 new investment partnerships just signed last week. So there's a lot happening. It's very difficult to keep up to date. So it's very fast developing space. Yeah, so thanks again for the overview. And yeah, actually also Canada laid a lot of the groundwork with the previous presidency of the G7 on minerals. Okay, Paolo, nice to meet you. Thank you for joining today.
Hello.
Over to you.
So thank you very much. Some basic, more general ideas about how to reconcilize economic security and international cooperation. There is an issue, a bit a step backward, that is the return of industrial policies in many countries. Because this is, I think, is the main framework where economic security is then falling. It's happening. So basically, the big challenge for countries like the G7 is to handle, to govern this returning issue of industrial policies, the intervention of the states in economies, and to have or to make sure that economic security, it falls into this dimension, into the dimension of returning industrial policy, because this opens then the floor on industrial cooperation, international industrial cooperation among advanced or like-minded countries. So first of all, I would see the main point is to focus on the return of industrial policies as a possibility of setting a new industrial cooperation that includes also economic security. It means that somehow, this is the world we live in, economic security should be sort of embedded by design into the industrial policies. Doing this, I mean that we have to avoid another scenario that is the possibility that economic security is more a function of national security. So it won't fall into the industrial policy, but into national security. And this will somehow makes more complex or more difficult the coordination, the international cooperation on the economic security. So first, this is, I think, the first building block, I would say, where in which public policies economic security stands in the national security or in the industrial policy. I think Italy Vision, or at least my personal one, I think this is a think tank gathering, so we are allowed also to use the country positions, but also to elaborate it a bit more. Is that the good thing as an open country to globalization, to trade? We would need
It seems we lost Paolo there.
Yes, I'm sorry for that, Patrick. Apparently, the connection from the
Connection lost. Okay, should we wait a few moments if he comes back? There, Paolo, you're back. Great.
Yeah, sorry, these
Yes,
things
no problem.
do happen when you try some unstable connections. But
yeah, no problem at all. Please continue.
So avoiding the securitization, because securitization brings a cost to the companies and to the firms that probably the G7 countries, but most of the countries of the world cannot stand, or cannot. It's a new burden that they cannot suffer. So we have to define exactly what is economic security and where it falls. Of course, this implies also avoiding duplication of resources among partner countries. So the most challenges, the most mission-oriented policies that can be shared among countries, that includes also the economic security dimension, should be pursued, because this is otherwise in a world of so scarce resources and so many challenges, it will be a big problem, especially for countries, and talking for Italy, but other countries with short fiscal capacity. The cooperation, international cooperation, should happen at the early stage of innovation and technological transfer, because this is now where the industrial policies are moving into. So if we fail to align and to coordinate countries on that level, then I think the consequences are already decided. Opposing or conflicting industrial policy, protectionism, and a different vision of the way forward. So the European Union, of course, as far as G7, have a special role in this field. And as far as critical industrial inputs, I would like to add a few things, because there are a mixture of policies among them that countries has to choose. There is not a single approach to this. Of course, there is a lot of stress, a lot of attention to issue of mining, so the extraction phase, how to take resources out of the land, but I would include also out of the sea, because we don't have to forget the option and the possibility open from the international seabed mining in the framework of UNCLOS and the International Seabed Authority that is opening a new possibility to many countries, also detaching the property of the materials to a single country and transforming it into a common good. I think this is a very positive approach that, of course, must be reconciled with the environment protection and the protection of the seas. But of course, we have to look at it. Another big step is investing in refining capacities together with the mining. Then we have also the possibility of investing in third countries' supply chains, so having a financial presence in key supply chains of raw materials. There is the issue of stockpiling. There is the important that actually Italy is quite good in this chapter of recycling, how to recycle the materials. This also works especially if you have a cheap energy. Otherwise, you may happen that recycling it's too costly, even if you are very good at it. Then also production efficiency is also a way to reduce the inputs that you need per produced unit. So you also have to work on more efficiency in the production system. And then you have also the prioritization, because in a world of scarce resources, you have also to benchmark those industries that are using the same inputs, and you can also make strategic priorities among them in order to have a different strategic vision of which inputs are prioritizingly needed for which industries. And finally, there is another not easy topic, but I think it's worth mentioning, is export control, because somehow you have to also control for some specific goods the possibility that it's leaving a certain area of industrial cooperation, and this is also part. So basically, it's not one policy; it's a mixture of 6, 7, 8 instruments that should be differently tailored according to which resources we are talking.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo. That's great. I mean, there's many very good points you made there on the policy package that you actually need. So touching upon industrial policy, but also trade related. One point you made I thought was very relevant, that economic security, or let's say securitization, does not necessarily equal economic security, as I understood. Right, because as you said, one thing we need to avoid is securitization, because that creates a lot of challenges also for industry. So I think that's very important also to unpack further what that means for minerals. I wanted, before we go to Gaylor's presentation, actually, there was a question in the chat, and I think, Allison, you might help me to answer that. It's a question on how the upcoming Evian Summit can build on the Kananaskis Summit's achievements on critical minerals, right? Because so President Trump being involved, but how can that then lead towards the plural multilateral critical minerals, let's say, framework or organization that is needed? Maybe if you have some thoughts on that, we can.
No, I'm happy to give it a try. You know, we're certainly looking to carry the momentum from last year's presidency into this year, and you know, with the establishment of the appointment of the envoys from each country, I think those conversations are continuing. And you know, we're supportive of the various expert groups and playing a lead role on leader level priorities on critical minerals through the G7. So I hope that answers the question. But certainly the work is continuing with the upcoming under France's presidency.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's difficult question, right? I guess it relates partly also to the critical minerals ministerial that was hosted by Trump administration just a few weeks ago, and
right.
Forge now being also a new, let's say, uh, kid on the block. I don't know if that's the right word. How does that how will that shape G7 dynamics in the upcoming summit? And but if anyone on from the audience has any thoughts on that, you can feel free to put this in the chat as well. But I mean, I think I hand over to Gaylor now to give you a presentation. Can you share your screen? Does that work for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick, and it's great to be here with you today. Good day to everyone. Really, the topic that we've been discussing for the last 1.5 hours is been on my mind very much so this week. Notably, I'm doing some field work at the moment in Namibia, and I've had the chance to engage with two companies, one called Clean Energy, the other one Iron, both in Namibia, who really exemplify what we're talking about. One is at the forefront of producing green hydrogen and green ammonia, and the other green iron. And these two investments, which are not theoretical, not on paper, they are actually producing, show that green industrialization, in the global south and particularly in Africa, is possible. It's doable. It makes sense. But it also shows that to make it happen, it needs a common vision. It needs a common vision from a lot of different partners. And that requires collaboration across public and private sector, across producing and consuming countries, and across all the actors across the value chain. And in both these cases, this is very clear that if one single partner didn't come on board, those investments wouldn't have materialized. But here they are, and they're producing and they are expanding. And so it really, provides a bit of a direction of travel for the work that I think we did under the task force on secure, responsible, and equitable critical minerals value chain in the T7, which I had the privilege of co-chairing with Patrick. What were our key messages from the task force? Firstly, it's clear that we need to build some bridges between G7 and G20 processes on critical minerals, and it is both to achieve mineral security on a global scale and shared prosperity between countries and between regions. And to do that, it's really important that we find a way to strike some international framework that reconciles the various interests of importing countries and of producing countries. And of course, that means we need to reckon with the fact that the interests are sometimes divergent, but actually come together because they work together effectively. Importing countries are primarily interested in security of supply, in market stability, in diversification, while of course producing countries prioritize, local value addition. And so mutually beneficial partnerships are really at the core of the work that we need to do. And that's, not only to address supply chain resilience, but also to support industrial deepening, technology upgrading, and value creation. We focused our attention on 3 key areas, which we see as complementary: to foster political dialogue on inclusive and responsible minerals value chain, to demonstrate the feasibility of responsible and inclusive mining value chains. And lastly, to strengthen the circularity of critical minerals within existing frameworks. To move forward, it is really important to take stock of the journey to date and the situation in which we are finding ourselves. It is evident, as I've said, that there are diverse visions out there, and that countries are at different stages of development and have different interests and things that they want to achieve. And I think it's important to reckon with that and not just, sweep it under the carpet and really say, well, how do we actually address those diverse visions, and how do we reconcile them and reduce the gaps between those? And of course, this is through partnerships that we can meet the interest of mineral importing countries and mineral producing countries. At the core of these diverse visions is, of course, the Chinese equation, which again, one should not ignore. It is important to reckon with the fact that trade and investment tensions between countries and global powers is increasingly shaping the global governance, and that makes it more difficult for all, both producing and consuming countries, and particularly, of course, in the global south, that is particularly difficult. We also need to make sure that we avoid a race to the bottom in that current context. There is a real risk that while we focus on security of supply and we focus on diversification and we focus on local value creation, effectively environmental and social safeguards are weakened, and that certainly the social standards are also not met. And one should try to reverse, of course, that race to the top. To do that, we need to also build on the ecosystem, and particularly, as already introduced, the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, but also the G20 Critical Minerals Framework that was negotiated last year. And I think the two, of course, provide a great deal of complementarity. Looking forward, it's evident that improving market stability and supply chain resilience requires to strengthen minerals value chain. And that needs to happen by creating diversified production hubs. And so that means really supporting effectively domestic value creation and structural upgrading in mineral-rich countries to support a more diversified ecosystem and a more resilient, a responsible, and secure ecosystem overall. And so what are 3 recommendations? We need to drive a political compact. We need to pilot flagship initiatives, and we need to implement partnerships. So let's delve very briefly into each of those to see what we recommend for G7 countries and beyond to do. Firstly, there is a real need to strengthen dialogue on inclusive and responsible minerals value chain. And here the G7 has a real opportunity to forge a balanced global approach to reconcile these diverse visions and interests that we spoke about. It is about forming a bargain to support downstream value creation in producing countries in exchange for greater security of supply, diversification, and stronger ESG legitimacy. But it's also about getting, of course, more regulatory stability, transparent governance, and sustainability standards. And that's the political bargain that needs to be struck. But then it has to be operationalized through a very strong and coordinated package of incentives across the value chain, from concessional finance to technology sharing partnership, skills development, and so on. We also need to see a stronger political commitment to local value creation in the existing initiatives. And that needs to be translated as well in the trade agreements that are being negotiated and the greater support that can be provided to Global South-led political initiatives, such as the African Green Mineral Strategy, to name just one. Secondly, we need to build on that political partnership and leadership to demonstrate the feasibility of responsible and inclusive mining value chains on the ground. We recommend for the G7 to launch a small number of what we call lighthouse, high visibility investment pilots that really demonstrate the commercial viability and the realism of socially responsible mineral value chains. That would, on the ground, through real investments, reduce perceived risks, set some standards and benchmarks, and demonstrate that it is actually possible and doable. Of course, as we've already heard earlier today, that would require some coordination between particularly DFIs to provide all the support and the finance that is required across the value chain. We notably need to see some systemic de-risking vehicles to cover non-commercial risks, especially to lower the cost of capital, which is often prohibitive in some jurisdictions, not because of real risk, but often because of perceived risks. And we need to make sure that these investment pilots really, of course, they show the direction of travel, and so they apply the highest standards that can be relevant and explicitly price social dividends. Last but not least, it is important for the G7 and countries beyond to strengthen the circularity of critical minerals within existing frameworks. We acknowledge that circularity is already high on the agenda. It is recognized in quite a number of initiatives that have been agreed upon by the G7 in the past. We have the Berlin roadmap on resource efficiency and circular economy. There is the G7 Alliance on resource efficiency, some coalition on resource efficiency and circular economy in industry, as well as the circular economy and resource efficiency principles that were negotiated. And many, of course, individual member states also have circularity at the center of their strategies. But what's clear is that there is a need for further coordination and practical implementation. And we propose a flagship circular critical minerals partnership to anchor circularity solutions at the core of existing initiatives while enhancing supply security, resilience, and sustainability. And importantly, this is to move really beyond voluntary coordination towards a platform for financing, standard setting, and policy alignment. And that means that there is much stronger alignment, policy alignment that's required between mining policy, waste management regulations, trade rules, and industrial incentives, among others. To support such initiatives, we need platforms for traceability that are interoperable and are transparent and are implemented across the value chain with support, particularly to countries in the Global South, to make sure that implementation takes place as intended. So what we put forward is really action at the political level, at the investment level, and at the standard level and the framework level going forward to drive the agenda of the existing G7 and G20 frameworks and action plans into action in the year to come. On that note, really invite you to engage with the solution paper, which is online. It's been really a collaborative effort with a number of us. Patrick and I tried to steer the ship as much as we could, but it really been great insights and collaboration from a number of partners contributing to these recommendations. On that note, I thank you very much. Patrick, back to you.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much, Gaylor, for the overview of the paper, and it's online, so more details in the paper. Just so Paolo already had to leave and join another meeting. And I think, yeah, just Allison, maybe quickly back to you if you had any further reflections on the presentation that just Gaylor just showed us.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you, Gaylor, for the presentation. You know, as I reflect on it, I find that it's all very consistent with a lot of the initiatives that I mentioned from Canada's presidency in terms of the action plan and the Critical Minerals Production Alliance, and the paper really just gives a bit more practical advice on how we can continue that momentum and bring it forward into France's presidency. You know, there's a lot of examples. You know, the Critical Minerals Action Plan provides policy principles and coordination mechanisms that really underpin the solutions paper. And then the roadmap really helps countries to advance actions and make those, I think, you know, concrete commitments that you're looking for in the paper to strengthen supply chain resilience and advance standards and things like that. And then finally, you know, the Critical Minerals Production Alliance provides that operational mechanism that is already delivering strategic and inclusive investments that the paper provides. So I think it's all really helpful and consistent and good advice moving forward.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Allison. I think as you highlight, it's good to hear that there's the consistency, that you see there's a line that goes through something rather than a rupture. So that's great to hear. So there's actually another question in the chat. Not so much a question, but this question by Nanda Janardanan, who is actually also part of our task force. I was wondering, Nanda, do you want to unmute and say your question? It relates to the securitization point that we had that Paolo mentioned earlier.
Patrick, I'm not sure that Nanda Kumar can actually unmute.
As a participant, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you read the question? Maybe
okay, I'll read out the comment that Nanda wrote in the chat, and so he's saying that he agrees that securitization needs to be applied carefully in the debates on critical minerals, in particular, focusing only on the securitization of supply may benefit a limited group of consuming countries, while environmental and social concerns, which are largely borne by producing and resource-rich countries, remain inadequately addressed. In this context, shouldn't securitization move beyond supply security and instead adopt a value chain approach to ensure that it is relevant for all stakeholders across the value chain? Certainly, this also highlights the importance of greater G7, G20 collaboration. So I think it's a good point, and maybe Gaylor or Allison, you want to comment on this. I think it's broadening the securitization out from a narrow focus towards really what it means, like security for whom, and if it covers the whole value chain, so it broadens the stakeholders that need to be considered in any securitization approach. And so I guess this is also what we tried to cover, where we were saying in our first point, the political compact or political renewed commitment between producers and consumers, and this closer alignment between G7 and G20. Yeah, Gaylor, I don't know if you would like to come in on that. Oh, and Nanda is able to speak. That's great. Okay, so how about Nanda? How about you first then?
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you, everyone. I think it is this is one of the points which we have been discussing very actively in the task force, that how well we should integrate or sort of strengthen the collaboration between G7 and G20. And even in Gaylor's presentation also, he highlighted this point. Probably securitization is one of the potential platforms to look at. And I was actually trying to link it with the earlier presentation that we were discussing about securitization for the securitization of supplies. And as Patrick, you rightly pointed out, I thought that it definitely has different dimensions. I mean, securitization has different dimensions. It shouldn't be only looked at through the supplies. We should also try to see how this this affects the environmental security. It affects the social aspects in producing countries, and also how the entire efforts can also contribute to strengthening the whole value chain, including bringing in better circularity practices, etc. So my point here is that, securitization, if you look at from the conventional Copenhagen schools view, you may get a narrow definition of any threat to your supplies as a national security threat. I think that shouldn't be applied here. My point exactly, as you also highlighted, that we should sort of try to broaden it and see that it goes beyond mere supplies. So it was more like a comment, but I'm happy to hear if you have any additional views.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Nanda, for expanding on this. Gaylor, Allison, do you want to comment on that or raise any other points? I'm having another look at the chat if there's been other questions that come in.
Sure. I think for me, it's what Nanda is raising is actually consistent with a lot of discussion that took place notably last year under the umbrella of the G20 around the importance of having whole of economy, whole of society just transitions. It's not just about the economic dimension, or it's not just about one sector of the economy. If we want to move sustainably across value chains, across economies, across communities, we need a holistic picture and we need a holistic approach. And I think that is the danger, of prioritizing one particular dimension over another, and then neglecting, of course, particularly the social and environmental aspects, which are foundational, and in the long run, make the whole value chain unsustainable. And so I think it's clear that we cannot achieve sustainability, of course, but I would argue even security without strong social and environmental standards overall. And again, I think that requires then a great deal of partnership and collaboration across countries. I would agree that with Nanda that it has to take a value chain approach. It can't just be on one particular aspect, and it's about finding ways to make it work for everyone. We know that there's a great deal of progress that need to be made in terms of stability of the value chains across countries. And so there's a realization that it's only by working together that that's going to be sustainable in the long run. And I think there's some steps that have been taken in that respect already. And so really it's about building on those going forward.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that a little bit, from Canada's perspective, producer and consumer countries have to work together on those hard questions that Gaylor's raising around sustainability. Mineral consuming countries need to take responsibility for the minerals they consume, and having transparency and ensuring that the industry is working towards ESG standards and things like that. And as well, supporting the capacity of mineral producing countries to adopt best practices, integrate clean technologies, and advance ESG standards as well. And so Canada's been championing these efforts through the G7 to provide capacity through various initiatives. But I hope that kind of brings that or underscores that point that Gaylor made.
Okay, great. Thanks, both. There's a couple of comments / questions in the chat. Interesting. John Curtin actually put in an interesting question, and I wasn't actually aware of that thermal coal is included in the critical minerals list of the US. I don't think it's on the list of the European Union, right? Because criticality varies from country to country. But I would agree, actually, it shouldn't be on that list. And I think to this end also, in the UN context, there's a different terminology that's being used. It's called critical energy transition minerals. And obviously coal wouldn't fit into that category. So I guess it's very much the criticality part is very political. It's not a very scientific classification. But yeah, I'm surprised to actually see that. Then there's a question here. If the panel could say something about how to best bring in a producer voice into the picture. We've spoken about G7, G20 bridging, but Africa is little represented in the latter. Even less so this year in the G20, but South Africa not being invited to join. I think that's a question to you guys that you should talk about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that is an agenda that was taken forward very strongly by South Africa last year in the G20, and at the cornerstone of that was the negotiation of the critical minerals framework, which I was fortunate to be part of the team that drafted that framework, and it really tried to bridge the interest of producing and consuming countries. And I think in that sense, the G20 is really well placed to do that. What we need to see is, how, of course, from a G7 perspective, which is a small group and is not going to change. Okay, that's why you have the G7 and you have the G20. You have both. How the G7 countries can take forward their part of the bargain, and I think the bridge that was certainly made by the French presidency, particularly to the BRICS, with the invitation to, of course, the Indian Prime Minister is important. And so I think that is something that we need to see in terms of how we take forward those various initiatives. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think there is really room to have a much stronger representation from global South partners in G7 discussions. But at the end of the day, I think we need to see that being taken forward within the G20. Of course, this year it's unlikely to be making a lot of progress on that particular front within the G20 context, and I think that's what we particularly looking to the G7 to hold that that discussion and being that bridge towards global South partners across the board. So I think we need to have a multiplicity of platforms, and I think that's why it's really important. It's not just one platform that's going to really solve the equation. Those who follow the climate negotiation would know that the topic of critical minerals came very strongly last year as well into the climate negotiations. Didn't make it into the final text, but it was a big negotiation issue as well. And so it is permeating in a lot of different fora. And so what I would close with is that not to see every summit, every gathering as a once-off. It is part of a process and a long-term process. And these discussions, particularly on critical minerals at the G7 and G20 levels, are relatively young, and so I think they will accelerate, and I think we're going to see that get some momentum, and of course, hopefully, everyone will have a strong voice in those processes, so that they can be representative, they can be inclusive, and ultimately they can be sustainable.
Yeah, maybe I could just add, beyond the G7, G20, there are other fora that these issues are discussed, such as the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining Metals and Sustainable Development, which has a much more deeper engagement on these issues with the countries that are involved, both producers and consumers, and is well understood is in a good position to understand the capacity building needs in other countries and things like that. The IGF includes 86 member countries, including those in Africa and Latin America, working with countries to build capacity, share knowledge, and improve technical assistance. And Canada plays a big role to build capacity there.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for adding that. There are indeed many initiatives that are emerging. I just want to, we're coming to the end, but a couple of comments by Sarang Shidore in the chat or in the Q&A, highlighting. I need to scroll back to it. Highlighting that security of supply chains is not just about China as key actor or preferred problematic actors, as you put it in your comment. But there's also systemic shocks that emerge across value chains on different nodes. And you mentioned the current war in the Gulf, in the Middle East, as a case in point. And then also increasingly non-human shocks, natural disasters or pandemics. I would include into this actually also increasingly extreme weather events by accelerating climate change. So this is a really important point. And that's actually is a good plug also where we try to bring in the circularity aspect as a key element of security or supply chain security. And in that case, value chain security, looking also at the end of life. So it's not only supposed to be an add-on, but I think we would like to see also circularity more embedded centrally in those discussions. There were a few other things that came up in the chat now. Not sure if we have time to answer that, but I was going to hand back to Sebastian for closing the session. And you might have also closing remarks or also a question around the Lighthouse project, how to demonstrate the win-win, which is a key question and difficult to answer, but we need to work on that for sure.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Just wanted to mention that Isabelle Randou, the director of the IGF, is online. She's just because Allison just mentioned the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining. So she actually interacted in the Q&A. Just for people who wanted to interact with her, she's there in the virtual room. And yes, thank you, Patrick. I just wanted to mention that not using my moderator's hat for the whole session, but rather intervening in the discussion on the mutually beneficial partnerships, because as a Paris-based think tank, we try to convince a lot of the European players that mutually beneficial partnerships are industrial partnerships, shared industrial ecosystems with, for instance, Southern Africa, is very important, and that this is mutually beneficial. But very often we are faced by the arguments that when everybody wants to move up the value chain, then it sounds like a zero-sum game of who captures the value or the industrial jobs. And we claim that there are lots of ways to consider this a win-win situation if we include innovation, but demonstration is key there. And so my question was about the recommendation by the T7 solutions paper on the fact that we would have a lighthouse project to demonstrate investments that are illustrative of this type of new equitable value chains that we want to build. But then this issue of how mutually beneficial it is in the end, when we want to win, when every country is seeking for industrial jobs, is probably something that still needs to be worked on. I mean, I don't know if Gaylor or Patrick, we have 1 minute for that. Patrick, you already said that's complicated. Any thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, the mutually beneficial part, I think this is very much about the question of benefit sharing. And then I guess the negotiations around the investments, who takes which part of the value capture. So these are, in a way, not necessarily a technical question, but I think at the heart, it's a political question. And that's where it links back also to the political compact. I'll just leave it at that. Gaylor, maybe you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some value chains where it's really clear that there are some synergies, and it's my recommendation would be, let's start where it makes perfect sense, and clearly, that's what's happening in discussions around green iron and green steel, for instance, between a couple of Southern African countries and a couple of European partners, where it just makes sense from the perspective of both industries, actually, to collaborate, because the absence of that collaboration probably leads in decline in both regions. But if there is a strategic partnership, both can have a role to play in the value chain, and it can be materially beneficial. It probably will be harder in certain value chains, but let's start where it makes sense. And I think we have examples of that on the ground already, or in the making.
Well, thank you very much for this answer, Gaylor. And Patrick, I don't know if you want I can close the whole session if you want, or did you want Allison or Patrick to say a last word? Allison? Patrick?
No, I'm happy for you to close it. Just thank you for hosting this today. It was very good. And thank you everyone for joining and your questions. And we hope to continue the discussion as well.
Well, on my side also, many thanks to you, Patrick, for facilitating this session, to Gaylor, Allison, and Paolo for their interventions. And Allison, very appreciated that in these conversations with think tanks that you chose to take time, like Paolo, to exchange with us. Really important to know how to build on Canadian leadership last year for the proposals for this year's G7. So thanks a lot. I will say a few words of closing for today's session. It's one way to do a kind of a recap of what we heard is actually that through the two examples that we've put forward, the two sets of proposals that we've put forward on the institutions for international partnerships and the industrial policies, I think we've heard a lot of very convincing arguments for coordination among G7 countries, but also with like-minded countries, and like-minded is a complicated term to be used today, but also with other economies in general. And that is particularly the way if we look at the issues of security, stability, for which, of course, it seems we have a lot of analytical arguments, but also political arguments to be used to show that cooperation is better for security and stability overall than just looking at power to secure something in a value chain or in an economic or a trade relation. I think this is, to me, very important, but I also heard, and I think to some extent, security, stability is the essence of G7 and G20 also. That's why they have been so urgently constructed when they were needed. But I think I heard also something beyond that about these mutual benefits that we could have. And in particular, in these two sessions, how economic partnerships are not just about security and stability, but about also joint value creation. Just what Patrick and what Gaylor was telling me. And I think this is really encouraging that the community of think tanks, but also some of the officials of G7 countries that are here represented, were really pushing forward a narrative and arguments around the fact that coordination is also for mutual benefits, not just in terms of security, but in terms of joint shared prosperity. I think this is something that that was really important for me to hear. And that is despite the fact that there might be divergences and competition. I mean, Clémence Lenoir from l'Élysée began by saying, we are in a time of predatory competition. And I think we have arguments to show that predatory competition is not the best way forward if we look at not just a long-term perspective, but also a mid-term perspective. The other point that I thought was very actively discussed is the idea that we need to be very practical and operational. That was Rémi Rioux saying it's the year of the plumbing. We need to look at pipes and channels and concrete examples, business cases, looking at supply chains players, looking for the ones that are the most convincing, etc. So I think a lot of the arguments for cooperation that we have are actually, or the types of recommendations that we have are at the scale. It's not about playing technical to avoid political controversy. It's just to show that politics also needs to follow pragmatism on what works and what is needed in several value chains in our relations in a world that is inevitably interdependent. And I think that's really very, very promising to me to try and show that coordination or cooperation in the G7, G20 context and more multilaterally is because we have very concrete economic cases, investment cases, business cases to talk about. And very tangible cooperation types of institutions, the plumbing that Rémi Rioux was talking about. That is, it makes sense. You don't have it. It's not about different political visions. It really makes sense, and that I think was also very striking to me. Just to say that I've been emphasizing a lot the issue of security and stability that was present all along the two sessions today. The teaser for tomorrow is that we have a session that is dedicated to resilience. It's another face of the same coin, but that I think is also very important in order to shape global cooperation in the G7 and beyond around that. I think I forgot one thing that I wanted to say on substance, that was that the space beyond G7 and G20, there are other countries, and there was this question about what about Africa? I just wanted to mention, I'm not sure that Clémence Lenoir pointed at that, but there is going to be a summit co-organized by Kenya and France that is not directly a G7 summit, but to which Prime Minister Modi has been invited as Prime Minister of India, probably also because he's chairing the BRICS, and also Chancellor Merz to make it more G7 or at least openly more European. And I think that's this summit called Africa Forward is going to take place mid-May. And that might be also a moment where I understand the French are going to open a space for a dedicated conversation on Africa. That might be the importance. Let me just thank very warmly all the speakers, Clémence Lenoir, Rémi Rioux, Axel Berger, Jiachun Su, Paolo Quercia, Allison Christie, Gaylor Montmasson-Clair, and the two moderators, Cecilia Tlasi and Patrick Schroeder. I mean, being so much on time is really always a challenge in those moments, and that was really excellent. Thank you so much for that. And in particular for the wealth of insights that were there. Thanks a lot to all the participants who participated to their questions in the chat and their comments. That's really very much appreciated. We could say that tomorrow, but this is just the beginning of the exchange between the solutions papers that are put on the table by the T7 and their potential uptake or discussions with the G7 officials in the G7 countries. But of course, as was said in this session, summits are just a series in a sequence that we need to think of, and so let's also think of the sequence that leads to the G20 and also other areas. That's going to be the session tomorrow. The second session tomorrow will be about exploring renewed cooperation across G7, G20, and BRICS, and across the years. I mean, let's think also of how to prepare next year's G20 under the British presidency. That's going to be also very important. So we will continue tomorrow, Wednesday, March 12th, with two more sessions starting at 12 CET. I will not go for all time zones, but we appreciate the people in the US East Coast joining at 7 a.m. and our Japanese colleague joining at 8 p.m. And session 3 will focus on strengthening resilience and protecting natural capital. Session 4 will explore pathways for renewed cooperation across G7, G20, and BRICS. Thank you to all for this very interesting session, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thanks to all the team that has been managing that this session could take place. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.